help to make that history speak to you on this. And really, we feel like it's really a privilege and an honor to have him come in each year, and he does make a sacrifice to come over here and share with us. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Mr. James Tribby. I guess I should say Master Sergeant of the U.S. Air Force retired. Is that right? Okay.
All right. Students, I am military-wise Master Sergeant James S. Tribby, U.S. Air Force retired. I am one of the survivors of the Bataan Death March. I fought in the South Pacific. I was a prisoner of war under the Japanese about 3.5 years. When I was captured, I weighed 220 pounds. When I was released from a prison camp, I weighed 97. You are probably looking at one of the biggest thieves the Japanese ever had. Also, whenever possible, to sabotage Japanese equipment in any manner in hopes that I would not be caught, because that was death if I was caught. In due respect to the students who passed on from this school, and for my wife that passed on the 21st of January this year, I'd like for you all to stand and bow your heads in silent prayer. Amen. You may be seated. First, I'm going to show you a group of slides that will bring you a little bit more up to date on what we're going to be talking about the Philippine Islands and the people in the Philippines, the conditions that they live in today, and it doesn't compare with 1,000 years ago. They're living as they did at that time. Now, if you'll give me the lights, please, while we'll start with the slide. That is your speaker for the day, and that's the uniform of about 1950. That is the uniform of 1950 again. This is taken in Norfolk Air Force Base, Norfolk, England. Next. This gives you a perspective of the Philippines. We are talking about 7,009 islands in the Philippine group. There is a very small portion of them that are inhabited. Many hundreds of those islands have no name, but Luzon Island, which is this island itself blown up somewhat, is the largest island in the Philippine group. Mindanao in the southern Philippines is the second largest. Now we're going to be talking about, this is the blow-up of the Philippine group. This happens to be Corregidor, which is a coast artillery battery in the entrance of Manila Bay. And from that island there to the mainland is 23 miles. This is the peninsula of Bataan, where the Battle of Bataan was fought. Manila is located here. Nichols Air Force Base is just about in that location. It's about 6 miles from downtown Manila. The island of Mindoro will be mentioned. That's this island. The Tanga Sugar Center on the coastline over in this location. Between the entrance past Corregidor and the entrance of Manila Bay was a concrete battleship which was called Fort Drum. It was a heavy artillery battery. It was built on the ocean floor. It stood about some 15 to 20 feet above sea level. The manpower was about 100 strong and about 8 officers. And on the opposite coast from Bataan, directly across the peninsula, or the Manila Bay, was Cavite Navy Yard. That should bring you up to date in regards to some of the things I'm going to be talking to you about. Next. Here is a picture of Manila Bay. This is the actual route of the death march, and the distance of the death march was something like 70 miles. There's a lot of controversy about the entire distance of it, and it lasted some 3 days and nights. At this point here was the end of the death march, and at that point they were put on railroad cars, narrow gauge tracks, extremely hot weather, and proceeded from there to the first prison camp, which was Camp O'Donnell. Camp O'Donnell set up in this area. No, I'm sorry. Up a little higher, up in here. Next. San Fernando, or San Fernando La Union, was the end of the actual death march. You see the names of the small villages, which are, they're living as they did 1,000 years ago. They're living in grass shacks. This road at that time was nothing but a dirt path practically. And from Manila proper to Bataan, or the end of the peninsula, was about 100 miles by road. Next. This is a shot of the military cemetery in the outskirts of Manila. It's the burial place for all those personnel lost in the Philippines, Java, Sumatra, Borneo, New Guinea. To the best of my knowledge, we have about 36,000 Americans buried there with an unknown name. We have 31,000 buried there that the name corresponds to the cross. Next. This is a picture of a man as he looked prior to World War II, prior to being a prisoner of war, and this is what he looked like after 2 years of captivity in slave labor camps. Next. This is a Marine that I knew. This is as he looked before being imprisoned. This is what he looked after 2 years of imprisonment. Next. This was a Navy man. He was a Navy chief. You can see this drastic change. This picture isn't the best in the world, but I'm sure you can realize what this gentleman had gone through with in 2 years of captivity, slave labor camps. Next. Another, he was an Army boy, and you can see what they've done to this fellow after about 2 years of imprisonment. Next. This is a picture of a Filipino being tortured by other Filipinos. It was one of their beliefs in the Philippines. If you were from a wealthy family and could find a Filipino and pay him to go through this torture treatment, it was a type of their religion. And he would carry a bamboo cross on his shoulders to the beach, place the cross in the sand, and after his back was cut considerably in many different methods by a cat of nine tails with razor blades and pieces of glass in the leather thongs. Frequently they would stop and use a knife to break the glass or the part of the blade out of his back so he would breathe continuously. Then he would go into the ocean, bathe, and come back and sit in front of the cross, and that supposedly got him back to their heaven. Next. This is a man still living. This is a picture that was taken by the Japanese, and we confiscated the film and was able to get this picture. You can see his main torso. You can see the actual rib cage. You can imagine what condition he's in, and he probably has gone down in weight from probably 200 pounds down to maybe 70 or 80. Next. This is a picture of some of the men that died on the death march. They're just lined up there. And this was a Japanese picture also. Next. This is a picture of the actual death march. You notice that they're carrying an object, which is a man just barely alive, that is made out of a military blanket, and they have that blanket secured to a bamboo pole. and two of his buddies are attempting to carry him through the entire death march and back to the first prison camp. Now realize, students, that on the death march, we're talking about 16,000 Americans. We're talking about probably another 40,000 Filipinos. Philippine Army didn't amount to much. Philippine Scouts and Philippine Constabulary were the finest troops you could ever fight with. But on the death march, Americans, in 3 days and nights, lost 4,500 Americans. And on the same march, we lost 13,000 Filipinos. Next. That's it. Flight, please. Now, you people, realizing who I am and what I am, I'm going to get out of uniform, and I'm going to try and keep everybody awake. And I'm going to tell you some stories that you're either going to believe me or you're going to think it's the biggest lie in the world. I'm most fortunate of surviving the death march. You sometimes wonder how much torture a human being can take, but it is hard to put into words what we actually went through. The fall of Bataan, at the fall of Bataan, we had probably some 16,000 Americans on Bataan, and the remaining number was on Corregidor. We had Philippine Scouts and Constabulary. We were fighting a war with equipment used in World War I. Those are some of the things that you're going to have to listen closely to understand. We are at Nichols Field, Philippine Islands. Conditions looked as though that we were going to be in hostilities with an enemy. We were talking about 3 or 4 months from the actual attack to the Philippines. We were preparing with what meager equipment we had to prepare for a war, not knowing what actually is going to take place in a war, how a man feels. Is he going to be yellow? Is he going to run? Or is he going to fight? You have two alternatives. Either kill or be killed. Now, during this first few years prior to the war, we were aware of Japanese moving into the Philippines. They were preparing in their own way, secretly, supposedly, in preparation of a war at some time. We knew that they were moving equipment into various locations. We knew from the southern Philippine Islands where we'd see a Japanese fishing boat come ashore with a casket, and this casket would be taken up into the hills and buried because they didn't approve or didn't like being buried at sea. And under those conditions, and we never investigated what it was, but later on, as months grew nearer towards war, some of those caskets were opened and they were filled with ammunition, guns, radio equipment, electronic devices. So we actually, some 37,000 Americans were caught behind the wall. We were, in my opinion, an oversized suicide squad. We had the capability, if we had the equipment, to fight off the enemy. And in our just way, we tried. Now we're getting up to the time of the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Let me back off a minute. We're going to tell you a little bit more about the Filipino people. The Filipino people, you're either rich or you're very, very poor. You live from hand to mouth. 1984, I made a trip back to the Philippines and took pictures of the various prison camps. I toured the Death March, which is a paved road today, and at that time was just a dirt path. The Philippine people are against the Americans. However, we do have 2 military bases in the Philippines, and it's very, very critical to these United States to have them. The conditions as we saw it, our chances were pretty slim on survival. On December the 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor was hit with every bit of striking power that the Japanese could muster. They hit Pearl Harbor, they sank ships, they put the Navy almost completely out of operation, or at least to the point that we had nothing to fight back with. I happened to be stationed at Nichols Field, 6 miles from downtown Manila. We got the radio report that Pearl Harbor had been attacked by the Japanese. 4 hours after, they came off the island of Formosa, which was Japanese owned. Pardon me. At midnight, 54 heavy bombers came over Nichols Field and opened the bomb bay doors and dropped a full load. Everything that was valuable they hit. We were at that time, when they came over, loading our aircraft with ammunition, raising the tails of the fighter airplanes and zeroing the guns in so that they would be accurate in fighting. And in that first bombing raid, Nichols Field was actually put out of order as far as fighting off an enemy. We were using what we call 30 caliber water-cooled machine guns, which were antique even in World War I. We had the Browning automatic, which is a rifle bolt action that held 20 rounds. We had the old Springfield, which was a bolt action single shot rifle. We had ample of ammunition. At the time they came over and hit Nichols Field, all we personnel had been called to arms and given a gas mask, a helmet, a weapon, ammunition. That first bombing put Nichols Field out of operation. The following morning at high noon, the Navy base caught it from a large number of enemy aircraft. I was on an assignment back to Cavite Navy Base, which is on the far side from Bataan, to clean up the terrible things that the Japanese had done. There were men, women, boys, and girls blown in all types of pieces. And I'm safe in saying that we had bodies stacked for 3 blocks in length and probably 4 feet high. They hit at high noon when the wives or children were taking the food into the civilian employees of this Navy base. The Navy had the old 4-stacker tin cans. They had what they called the pig boat, which was a submarine type boat. Within a few hours after that, they hit Clark Field. Now remember, we're talking about soon after the 7th. Clark Field had their aircraft. There were about 38 B-17s. That was the old Flying Fortress. They were all lined up on the runway. They had all been loaded with bombs to hit the island of Formosa, which is Japanese owned. Weapons were primed and ready to go for an attack. And believe it or not, we received word from Manila proper. Unload your weapons, unload the bombs, stand by for further notice. We have not officially declared war on the Japanese. You take all these thousands of Americans attempting to fight. I'm sure that any one of you, if you walked down the street and somebody poked you in the nose, you'd poke them back. You wouldn't wait and make a big final agreement like this. The Japanese came over and dropped everything that they had possible. Now remember that the island of Formosa is in flying distance of the Philippines. When World War II broke out, we Americans had something close to 200 airplanes. The island of Formosa, even after or before the attack on Pearl Harbor, they had 3,000 airplanes. Now, under those conditions, our chances were very, very slight as far as surviving. Pardon me just a moment. Back during the Spanish-American War, 1898, the Americans ruled the Philippines. They ruled them until after World War II. The Americans trained the Philippine Army, the Philippine Scouts, and Philippine Constabulary. They were a fantastic group of men, and believe it or not, in the beginning of World War II, we had one cavalry regiment, horse-drawn. So that's taking us back a good many years to have an attack in that manner. They had decided in all those years, from 1898 up until World War II, that if we were ever attacked by land or by sea or by air, there was no possibility for us to hold our own lines with the enemy. It was planned at that time that the people, military personnel, would evacuate all the military bases, 31st Infantry, the horse-drawn cavalry, the tank corps, the Philippine Scouts, Philippine Constabulary will move to Bataan. Now Bataan being a peninsula surrounded on three sides by water, the process of closing down the air bases, all military installations. Can you imagine when you have something like 50 to 60,000 men just to feed? It's a massive operation. This started about the 10th of December, and we had completed our move to Bataan by 1 January 1942. Now we had thousands upon thousands of civilians that lived in Manila proper, civilians that had gone to Bataan not knowing what the Japanese would do when they came in to attack. Manila was declared an open city. If you go by the Geneva Conference, when you classify it as an open city, there will be no bombing, there will be no strafing, there will be no killing in that particular city, and that city was about 1 million people, or close to 1 million people. So we have thousands upon thousands of people that are not military, that are living behind our lines in the jungle. And when I speak of jungle, you're talking about a place that you can't walk through unless you cut your way through. We're talking about jungle that is almost impossible to travel in. Under those conditions, and moved to Bataan, we had all kinds of equipment. We had food, we had ammunition, we put up 2 hospitals, which the Japanese later bombed, even though there were Red Crosses on the tops of them. There were 2 other men and myself volunteered. This is one of my big mistakes. I always volunteer, just like coming to talk to you students, I volunteered. That made a trip back to Manila to load up more equipment to fight a war. we made 2 successful trips. Now we're talking about 12 hours each way. The largest semis that we had in those days are not near as large as what we have today, but they are large. We loaded them with ammunition, medical supplies, food, parachutes, gasoline, you name it, and we loaded it. We made the return trips back to Bataan, and the first 2 trips went fine. We loaded most of our equipment from Nichols Field, in the outskirts of Manila. The 3rd trip, we went into Manila, loaded these 3 semis, and prepared to go back to Bataan. And after we got out a few miles, maybe 20 miles out, now Bataan itself, from Manila proper, is rice field for probably 50 to 60 miles. You're talking about lowlands. The little shacks and villages are innumerable on the route out. We found that the Corps of Engineers had blown the bridges up, and we were on the wrong side of the street. So we proceeded to turn these semis around and came back into Manila. And the first thing we did, we dropped off the trailers out in the outskirts of Manila and set them on fire and destroyed them. This is one of the things, students, that by all means, whatever chance you take, you destroy your equipment as much as possible, because they certainly needed it. They needed gasoline, they needed everything. We destroyed those 3 vehicles by burning them. We went back into Manila and reported to the civilian police. Now remember, this is a city of approximately 1 million people. Mode of transportation in the Philippines was very, very meager. Their mode of transportation was in a carameta, caratella, and a calisa. A carameta is one that you can haul human beings, chickens, pigs, you name it. It's pulled by a pony. It's a 2-wheel car. The carameta is one that is dressed up somewhat, and that would be what you'd utilize if you had a date, all decorated with fancy fringe around it. I remember one time, and we were just dropping off with a story for a minute, but there was a boy by the name of Bob Dunn and I had gone to this little barrio town, and we had a nickel was a highball, and we were 7,000 miles from home, and we were riding in this carameta, and Bob Dunn kept scooting forward, and I wondered what the heck was going on. The Filipino driver that sits over the rump of the pony has a seat that slides back and forth. Well, the more Bob moved forward, and the more he moved me forward, the more out on top of this pony this driver was riding. And all of a sudden Bob swung his arms back and knocked me back against the back of the seat, and the pony went in the air. It turned over on its back. And it was either the pony, get out of the way of the pony, or get killed, but that's something that actually happened that was amusing for us at the time. We are now have reported to the police, and we have decided that they gave us an answer to surrender and turn in our weapons. And knowing Americans as we are, we did not surrender. We went around Manila Bay on the Pasig River, and we had a Army, Navy, YMCA club there, place for good food and meet a girlfriend and what have you. And we proceeded to set these 3 tractors toward the docks, pulled out the hand throttles, dropped them in gear, and bailed out. They went down in about some 60 feet of water. Now, realizing that we have no possibility to get back to our forces by land, there was only one alternative, and that was by water. On Bataan, we had a total of 7 airplanes to fight the Japanese with 3,000 airplanes. Our odds are pretty small, aren't they? We went by foot around Manila Bay to what is known as Manila Boat and Yacht Club. We confiscated or stole a 40-foot sailing boat which was called the Southern Seas. Believe it or not, students, this particular boat was in a film in these United States called Typhoon. And some wealthy person had bought this, and he ended up in the Philippines, and we confiscated his boat. Across from Dewey Boulevard at this yacht club, there were some 200 American vehicles that were brand new, had just arrived in the Philippines. We proceeded to destroy those, as many as possible, and we had a bonfire of bonfires, brand new equipment. Jeeps, staff cars, 6x6s, you name it, and we had it. We realized that the Japanese are within a few miles of Manila. We had received word by what we call bamboo telegraph that they were actually making an advance on Manila proper. They were coming by the thousands on bicycles. Now we're talking about thousands of Japanese. They brought in on their first landing some 200,000 men. Before Bataan and Corregidor surrendered, it took their second army before that we actually surrendered. So you can know that we did a lot of fighting beforehand or during that time. It was about just before dusk. We took this sailing yacht and we picked up 5 or 6 other men at this yacht club, put them aboard, and we attempted to go across Manila Bay to what was known as Cabin Dock. It was a dock that was very, very small, just inter-island ships could come in there, inter-island boats. We started out across Manila Bay and got out of that breakwater. The whole heavens turned loose with fire and smoke of the destroying and the destruction of all the equipment in Manila deemed to fight a war. We're talking about tank farms like you see when you go around 465 in Indianapolis. Huge tank farms with diesel fuel, gasoline, kerosene, and what have you. The prime purpose was to destroy it all. The entire heavens was aflame. Smoke, billows of smoke coming up in the middle of that city that is unbelievable. Realizing that these Japanese have bombed everything in Manila proper, they had hit what was known as the walled city, which was built in the 15th century. That was when they were fighting off the Spaniards. The devastation was unbelievable. There were 4 piers in Manila Bay for ships of all kinds from all over the world. They were either burning or going down. As we traversed back and forth between the various ships and seeing thousands of bodies in the water, you can't put into words the actual feelings of seeing all this done to capture some 16,000 Americans. Pardon me. How much time is left?
18 minutes in this first period.
Students, I wish you could do it for 2 hours, and I hold back in. This is quite a chore, and for some unknown reason, each year I get a little older. I'm 103 now, as of the 23rd of April. I'm actually will be 72. I stretched that story a little bit, didn't I? We are attempting to get through Manila Bay, and of course darkness has come upon us. You still could see, because of all the ships that were burning or blowing up, most all the ships had ammunition and bombs on them. They were most all American ships in the bay, and the Japanese were having a field day. Japanese Zeros, bombers, dive bombers, anything in the world to utilize to hit this huge city and all the outlying areas that were still existing that had military equipment or whatever it might be there, and destroy it. We made it through the night, and the following day we were probably, now think about this, students, we're only 23 miles we were going to travel. If we could go a straight line and not knowing how to navigate, it was quite difficult. We were a long way from shore, or cab and dock, the following morning. And then came in the Japanese Zeros strafing us on this little boat that's probably moving 3 miles an hour. God in heaven was working overtime because we never were hit. We continued in the early afternoon of that first day. We were probably within a mile or so of cab and dock, and of all things to have happened, we lost the rudder cable and we couldn't control it in the direction of the sailing boat. Here again, and I'm not saying this because I did it or first person, it was most all we. I volunteered to swim ashore and get a tugboat and come out and pull us back into shore. They covered my body with axle grease, number one reason, so that if there was any bleeding on me, and we're in shark-infested waters, that no doubt the shark would leave me alone. Your speaker today is probably one of the luckiest guys in the world, because I have volunteered so many times. They say a cat has 9 lives, and I think I've got 27. But I have, in some manner, made it through to the point that I can talk to you students and tell you some true stories. I made the crossing, and I thought probabilities, it seemed like 500 miles. I have no knowledge of how far I swam, but we did get the tugboat in. We did rejoin our own forces on the front line, and I happened to be at Bataan airstrip, cabin airstrip, and that's where I was supposed to join if I ever got back out of Manila. And we're talking about a period of a couple days of hell, and we really went through it. We went to our troops, and finally the Japanese are moving in to make their attack on Bataan. It's far enough out to the tip of Bataan because we were in a mountainous area. We had a distance of several miles to put up a fighting line to hold the Japanese off from getting behind our lines. The coastline, ocean and Manila Bay and around on the China Sea side, had to be guarded at all times. High cliffs around at what they call the Battle of Agaloma, and in dense jungle forming these lines. Some of the things the Japanese would do to attack. This is hard for you students to believe, but it's true. The Japanese knew where the weak points in a fighting line, which was the Filipinos that had been put in the Philippine Army. They were called to active duty just a few days before the war actually took place. They were given a rifle which they had never fired one before in their life, and they would hit this segment of the front line. In most cases the line would break and run, and then it had to be flanked and brought back into position. The Japanese did not take cover when they would make an attack. We know this is one of their beliefs, they carry a little leather pouch on their belt with Japanese earth in it. The Japanese are very, very brave. They'll never fall backwards, they fall on their stomach. When they fall on their stomach, they're laying on their own soil, so they went to heaven. Now that's a little bit different from our beliefs, but this is the actual truth. As the Japanese moved forward to make these drives to our forces, many times they would take a Filipino girl and tie her on a bamboo carrying or framework to carry her and attack a Philippine army. The Philippine army tended not to fire at them. That Filipino girl was probably already dead. They would take Filipino girls, very attractive girls, and they'd dig a hole in front of their forces and bury this poor girl into the ground in an upright position with nothing but the head extended above ground line, and they would pour sugar water over the top of her and let the ants take her life. Those are things that we saw every day. Torture was unbelievable. They had every imaginable way of torturing too. We're getting these heavy attacks, and it's known now actually how many the Japanese lost on Bataan to capture some 15,000, 16,000 Americans and the scouts and constabulary. The Japanese brought in their second army before we actually surrendered. The Japanese on Bataan alone lost 193,000 men to capture some 16,000 Americans that were on starvation diet. We were down to a fifth of a ration. Our food supplies were getting very, very small, only 2 meals a day, and that was very meager. You not only have to fight the Japanese, you have to fight the jungle and the wildlife in the jungles. The various diseases that were incurred in regards to fighting a war and being in a weakened condition like this. We had malaria, dysentery, dengue fever, yellow jaundice, beriberi, and those are some of the things that we had to contend with. If we weren't fighting Japanese, we were fighting for survival. There were a few times when we were not being bombed daily. They came from Formosa to begin with, and then they had Clarkfield and Nicholasfield. Those fields had fallen. They utilized those and only had to fly a very short distance to hit Bataan. They bombed Bataan and Corregidor incessantly, morning, noon, and night. And we dig into the foxholes and hope that we can survive. During the Battle of Bataan, we had 3 retreats. The military call it a strategic withdrawal. Actually, what takes place when all these thousands of dead and wounded Japanese and Americans, they don't take care of their dead, they leave them. So with the disease that's carried with the mosquito and the flies and what have you, and the filth that you had to work in, we had no alternative but to move back. Now we're talking about up until about the first day of April 42. I always will remember this because I said when I was actually a prisoner of war, if I lived to my birthday, I'd make it all the way through. My birthday happens to be the 23rd of April. In school days, when I went to school here in Montgomery County, the 21st of April was the end of school. You have another month to go about. Those situations that took place, we ate caramel ponies. We ate caribou, which is water buffalo. If you were lucky enough to have a parade ground and have a cat or dog pass through, they didn't have a chance to make it. I have attempted to eat monkey, and it cannot be swallowed in my book. But we're living in the conditions that any human being shouldn't have to stand, and we were still a free country. Then orders came through from the Pentagon that all military forces in the Philippine Islands on Bataan shall surrender to the Imperial Japanese government. This happened on the 9th day of April. 45 years ago, the 9th of April, is when I first ended up as being a prisoner of war. We were ordered to surrender, and the location for the surrender was called Bataan Airstrip. It was a dirt strip that the military had made during the time that they had been on Bataan. What white cloths or sheets that they could find from the hospital was taken out and spread on this runway and the grass areas on both sides. And we destroyed every bit of ammunition and weapons that we could possibly destroy, not knowing what it would be like to be a prisoner of war, have no knowledge of what it would be like. Slave labor camp for 1,257 days is what I went through with. That's about 3.5 years. After this formation started building at this airstrip, even though we were supposed to surrender, destroy our weapons, Japanese came over with Japanese Zeros and fired upon anybody that was moving. There was not much use to surrender. You're going to be killed anyway. Well, this went on, and the formation for the death march was started. On the death march, within a couple hours after the march had actually started, they were marching 4 abreast. The Japanese were lined up back to back on either side of this formation, 6 bayonets. And that is why they called it the death march, because of the number of Americans lost in such a short period of time. It's unbelievable what they would do to the American when he fell by the wayside to get a drink in a mud hole where many bodies were laying. Normally they either pushed a bayonet through him or they shot him. As far as I'm concerned, those bodies are still laying there. I'm sure that they never retrieved those bodies. Cabanatuan prison camp, which is one of the prison camps in central Luzon Island. We had a burial detail that would actually anywhere from 50 to 150 Americans per day for a period of quite some time. They were stripped of what little clothing they had, and they were buried in a hole that held 20 bodies. Those are things that happened after the actual death march was over. We have surrendered to the enemy. A boy by the name of Bob Dunn and Howard Suttle and myself escaped for a second time. Good Lord sure took care of me in some way. I sure had him working overtime. I escaped on the death march. I think that everything that the Japanese had fired at us, I was hit once, but didn't slow me down. Yes, I have been wounded 3 times in combat, and most wonderful thing to be here and tell you youngsters this story. We escaped, and at night, the death march is proceeding. By the way, I can remember one time when the civilians were surrendering this same area. where a Japanese took a small baby that was just a few days old, threw it in the air and caught it on a bayonet as it fell. I hope you students can understand a lot of these things because it was hell. I've been to hell, and the next time I die, I plan on going to heaven. But under these circumstances, and everybody on the death march, and we luckily escaped, we confiscated or stole a fishing boat, which is known as a banca. It's about 16 feet long. It's a hollowed out log. It has outriggers on it that's made of bamboo. And we three men attempted after dark to leave Bataan in this small fishing boat, pass on the outboard side of Corregidor, knowing that some 40 miles out is the Japanese battle wagons firing on the rock. We made it through the night and up till soon afternoon of the second day. Our plan was to work toward the southern Philippine Islands in hopes that we might get out to Australia. And then of all things to have happen, a Japanese subchaser spotted us at sea. Now we're out in open seas in a 16-foot boat. And they proceeded to take us aboard. Very cautiously we dropped our weapons over the side into the ocean and destroyed what ammunition that we might have had on us. And we're taken aboard this Japanese subchaser. Now we are going to get into some of the things that is unbelievable. They're honest to God true. They're hard to believe. But I didn't come here to tell a bunch of lies.
Tribby, you got about a minute and a half. Did you, interrupt you, did you want to tell them how you got away that first time? Because you're just about out of time this first time.
The first time I jumped over a bridge into a mountain stream, and believe you me, I didn't even know there was water in it. So that's taking a chance. I knew that I could never survive the death march. And I had been losing weight. I had dysentery and diarrhea and malaria. And those three things is enough to take one's life. But that's how we actually escaped. You've got about a minute and a half?
Yeah, I didn't really want to get into some of that other, but it's time.
I would approve of a short talk, not a short rest.
Also, I want to thank Mrs. Price for taking this course.
I want to thank her also. Earlier.
Yeah, it was nice. Then we can sell this. It's so
Thank you. We're going to try to do today.
Anytime you want to start.
Okay. Everybody all ready? I'm not, but I'm going to try. I have just been picked up by a Japanese subchaser, and we're off the coast of Mendora, and we're also off the coast of Batangas Sugar Center, which is on the mainland of the island of Luzon. Batangas Sugar Center had about some 4,000 people. When we were put aboard this Japanese subchaser, we found to our surprise that there were 20 other Americans, prisoners of war, been picked up at various points throughout the Philippine Islands. Those 20 men were alive, but that's about it. Their hands had been their wrists had been bound with what I call baling wire, farmer's friend, behind them in this manner. There was a half-inch hemp rope threaded through each pair of arms and the two bitter ends secured. They worked us over by beating us with bamboo poles and what have you, and they placed us in that string of 20 Americans, and we end up with 23. There had been quite a large Navy battle in that immediate area, and as the rumor passed on, they were going to walk us over the gangplank, drop us into the ocean where all the shark-infested waters. They lowered the gangplank to be for us to line up and go over. And here again is another one of my 9 lives. They proceeded to raise the gangplank and take us ashore to Bataan Sugar Center. The word from the Filipinos was that we were going to be placed in front of a firing squad in this little village of Filipinos. And I'm not one to give up. We were hauled from the subchaser to the mainland on landing craft that the Japanese had. Then we were placed on Japanese trucks and taken into this small town. A town, by the way, students, we call it Barrio in the Philippines. And they're living just as they did 10,000 years ago. Supposedly they were going to have us in front of a firing squad, so my next alternative was to bail off this truck and run into a cane field. They had around this cane field, I'm talking about sugar cane field, it grows about some 12, 15 feet in height. Around this cane field they had bamboo towers built with machine gun nests on them. And they utilized those in firing at us, or firing at me, and failed to hit. There was one Jap caught up with me and made one pass with a bayonet, slashing my left leg above the knee. And I proceeded to throw him over my shoulders in an attempt to kill him, and he hit a swamp area of quicksand and disappeared. Realizing now that all these other Japanese in this town and that immediate area was not aware of that happening, they dragged me back into this little Filipino village, and they were going to impress upon the Filipinos that they were in control of the Philippine Islands. The Japanese were going to do this. They had a small stage built of bamboo, probably 10 feet in length and about 4 or 5 feet wide, about 3 feet above ground line. And they tied me to a pole that was secured in the center of that little stage, tied my hands behind me and around this pole, and proceeded to give me the torture treatment. To this day, I don't know how long it lasted. I can remember passing out several times, and then a Filipino would bring a bucket of water and pour on me, and then they return the same treatment. I was barely able to walk with other men helping me. They loaded us aboard a Japanese truck or trucks and took us to what they called Tagaytay Ridge. Tagaytay Ridge was a Filipino training center up high in the mountains. They took us to this training center and put us into a basement. It looked almost like a dungeon. Tied us up in the same manner, and we spent 3 days and nights with no water, no food, nothing at all in there, and kept us in this same location. Mother Nature calls. If you had to go to the bathroom, you did it right there. You laid in your own stench. It's unbelievable what a man can take to survive. To this day, I sometimes wonder. I sometimes have dreams, horrible dreams. And when I awaken, why, I stabilize myself again. This has gone on for some 40 years. At the end of that 3-day period at Bataan Sugar Center, they took us on trucks and took us down into the Manila to the little town called Pasay. They took us to a school which covered probably 3 city blocks in length and maybe 1 in width. And there were about 400 or 500 prisoners placed in this internment area. And at that time, they sorted out men that were physically able to work and sent them on details throughout the Philippine Islands as slave labor. I was one of 50 that was taken to Santa Mesa Skidway, which is on the Pasig River, inland quite a little distance from Manila Bay itself. And we worked on board, or worked on Japanese landing craft that had been used to take Corregidor when it surrendered. We worked on all types of equipment in there, and they seemed to know more about our capabilities as far as work than our own armed forces knew. For some unknown reason, they knew that I was an electrician. I remember a case where they brought a Japanese truck in, and he had utilized the American flag for a seat cover in this truck. They had a low-ranking, non-commissioned officer in charge of this detail, and I politely let this man know, he could speak broken English, that this was not the just way for an American flag to be treated. And I thought that that was probably the end of me, but instead of that, this non-commissioned officer took his large cheese knife with the sheath on it and almost beat this truck driver to death. We spent some 10 weeks in this particular prison camp. We worked on the various equipment and repaired it, kept it running for them. You can do those things with a bayonet stuck in your back, but other than that, that's the only way you're going to get anything out of me. At that time, this prison camp broke up, and we were taken to the Manila Port Terminal building on the docks of Manila Bay, and it happened to be directly across the street from Pier 7, where the big ships and liners comes in for troops or whatever it might be. This prison camp was probably the major reason why I survived. I stole the Japanese blind in regards to food. Now, realizing, students, that if you're caught, it's death. But you can do a lot of things when you want to live. We worked for about 2 years on Japanese ships handling cargo. We're talking about a large ship coming in with a load of sugar, rice, salt. We would break down the load to various small vessels so that when they took it back to their homeland, there's a possibility of one or more of them being sunk, but they wouldn't lose the entire cargo. I'm talking about we as prisoners, some 400 men. As it happened, our commanding American officer his name was G.G. Horrigan. His initial was G.G. He was a Navy man called back to active duty. He was a fantastic man. He had tattoos from one end to the other on him, but he was a real American. They wrote a book one time about him, and they called him, as he came from San Francisco Bay, well, we called him Golden Gate Harrison and the 400 Thieves. That was our name of our prison camp. That was the name that we made for him. While working in this prison camp at one time, and I can verify this, we stole a Japanese camera that had taken pictures. We fellows that had been prisoners of war for some 2 years. We put the film in a quart fruit jar and we hid it in the attic of the Manila Port Terminal building. After World War II was over, a man by the name of, I can't remember his name, I'm sorry, retrieved that quart fruit jar with the film in them, and they developed those pictures, and those are some of the pictures that you saw on the screen when we first ran the slides, where what he looked like before he was a prisoner of war and after spending 2 years. As far as sabotaging the enemy, on board these Japanese cargo ships, loaded with every imaginable piece of equipment for fighting a war. We did everything in the book to slow them down. There was plenty of sugar that would come in ships from the southern islands, and we could just pour those gas tanks full of sugar. And you know what happens when that happens to an engine. We found 3 cans, 100-pound cans of carbide on the docks. Carbide is a granular substance that with water it will form a gas and explode. I can remember as a youngster where we used to make carbide cannons and fire them at the 4th of July. We loaded out a ship with cargo, and as we stacked this load, and we're talking about some 40 or 50 feet down below water level, the various decks, we loaded this ship with salt, sugar, and rice. And as we stacked it so there was an opening all the way from the hatch or the top hole down to the bilges, which is the bottom of the ship, down in the keel area, and there's always water down there. We slipped those 3 100-pound cans of carbide aboard and laid them close to this opening and put the hatch on and dogged it down, the canvas and so forth, ready for open seas. No one will ever know the answer to the story that I'm telling. They pulled out and dropped anchor, and at that point they took on about 8,000 troops, fully manned with their weapons, ammunition, and so forth, and proceeded to go to sea, probably to a combat zone. From the second story of Manila of this prison camp we were staying in, Manila Port Terminal building, we could almost see Corregidor, which is about 30 miles out, about 23 miles out. They finally pulled anchor and sailed toward the opening out of Manila Bay, and several miles out we heard one heck of an explosion. This ship blew up and went down. We will never know whether we were the ones that did this or whether it was an American submarine that sneaked in the channel and came in and stuck a torpedo in it or not. We have no knowledge of what took place, but morale-wise, those 400 thieves were in high heaven. We weren't tortured for any particular reason because they had no knowledge of what had happened. And that was one of the things that we did get away with and not get tortured. This 2.5-year period, or 2-year period at Fort Erie Detail, I had been able to steal what they call blackout curtains off the ships and make a pair of so-called barrel bottom trousers, larger at the foot. And with that in mind, I was able to steal canned goods and tie them on the inside of my ankles and cover with this blackout curtain. Remembering now, students, that if you get caught, why, it's still death. But there's been many times that I've gone out on a work detail and come back and go through this routine. They'd shake us down to see that we had no loot on us, and never did they find those cans of food. It might be sweetened condensed milk, it might be sardines, it might be some type of food, but whatever it was good to eat. At one time, after about 2 years, this prison camp broke up. We know that there are prisoner of war ships being taken back to Japan proper. We're talking about a ship with no markings, no indications on it whatsoever, but there's Americans aboard that ship being taken back to their homeland. I have no idea on how many thousand were attempted to take over, but after this prison camp broke up, I was sent to Bilibid Prison, which was a civilian prison where American prisoners of war were kept that were very, very sick, and thence to Cabanatuan and back to Manila. Cabanatuan was some 80 miles inland. We then were brought back into Manila, and the more physical fit ones were taken from this camp and put on board ships in Manila Bay. We're talking about 1 year before the end of the war. God knows what else is going to happen, but here we're leaving the Philippines, which we knew quite well. We did have a few friends in the jungle. Now, realizing that when these prison camps were formed and the details that were taking place, under normal procedure, if a man escaped in a prison camp, when we had these formations morning and night, now remember this doesn't sound too fantastic, but it actually is true. We have a formation morning and night, and they count off in Japanese commands. You come to attention, Kyusuke, that's attention. Niggerai, dress right dress. And nay is you bow to the Japanese flag, and Laura, you come back to attention. For 1,257 days I did that with bayonets at our backs, knowing that my life would be taken if I didn't do it. But the thoughts that went through my mind overrode that. We went aboard these Japanese prisoner of war ships, and as I remember, the one in front of us, it was a small convoy of 3 ships, no markings whatsoever on them. The first ship in line had some 1,800 Americans. The second ship in line had 1,050. I happened to be one of that 1,050. The third had about 1,500. And after laying there in the harbor, down in the hold of a ship with no air, starvation diet, we named them the Hell ships. Those ships were rigged for cargo, prisoners of war in the hold of a ship. And as I remember, when this one hole in this ship, a lot of you have never seen large ships, but we're talking a hole 1 deck down. When 1,050 men were placed in this hole, you were standing in an upright position. There was a human being's body against the left arm, the right arm, the front of your body, and the back of your body. That's how you were pinned down in there. They finally pulled out, and we're talking about temperature of about 120 degrees. These men are starved, they're sick, they're dying right there in the hole because of starvation and lack of food and air and water. They proceeded and pulled out to sea, and it was known as the Hell ship. To travel some 3 days and nights, it took us 18 days living in the hull of this ship. Pardon me just a moment. In the hull of this ship, and these men and the conditions, the food that we did get was lowered on a rope, in a wooden barrel or keg. The waste matter from human beings, 1,050, went out in the same manner. There was no such thing as a bathroom. There was no such thing as cold water. And the men were dying down in that hole like flies. When one man would pass out, this is a known fact. It has happened many, many times, and I've witnessed a few times. We were like animals. We were far lower than an animal. We were fighting for our own survival. But we are in the hold of that ship, and there's no possible way of living. I've seen men on their last breath where another prisoner of war would slit his throat and get the blood to drink. So help me God, that's the truth. When a man passes on and they take him out of the hull of the ship, they usually tie him onto a bag of coal so his body would sink. The reason for that being is if there was American submarines in the area, which there were many, the body would sink and the submarine couldn't track where this actual prisoner of war ship was heading, or the routing that it was going. I have no knowledge in knowing how many men we lost on board that ship, but it was quite a large number. American submarines had a field day. They hit the front ship with 1,800 aboard. Every man in the whole of that ship begged for it to hit ours because we were that near gone. They hit the ship behind us. To the best of my knowledge, of 1,800 and 1,500, there were about 400 that made Japan proper. This is again why I call it the hell ship. After arriving in Japan, we were transported by rail up into northern Honshu to a copper mine. They had us in all these various places. We came out of the tropics and go up into northern Honshu. It's extremely cold. Our wearing apparel was a G-string. We hadn't had shoes for 2 years, 2.5 years. If we had a T-shirt, we were extremely lucky. But our wearing apparel was very meager. If you can realize of spending in this copper mine 1 year, we had no such things as a pencil, a piece of paper, a needle, the minimum of things that you would just normally know about here in the States. For 1 year, I spent in that prison camp with not the first bath. There was no place to bathe. We worked in the copper mine. We took the place of the donkeys that pulled the carts of ore through the mine. As far as copper is concerned, coming out of the hole of that mine was 5%. They needed copper. It is required for fighting a war. The mine had been abandoned for many years. And this mine went in underneath the mountain some 40 miles. With rooms off on either side of that 40 mile in length of the mine. We are about 30?
About 28.
About 28. This is difficult, students, to end up at the right time. I remember one time as a prisoner of war in this copper mine, I stole. Remember now, we've got about 13 7/10 meters of snow. A meter is 39 3/700 inches. So we're talking about several feet of snow that is packed down, and we follow that trail back and forth to the mine each day, which is about a 2-mile march. With men in dysentery and diarrhea and can't control himself, you know what the condition might be. And especially with no baths for 1 year, we were worse than animals by far. During this 1 year, one time I went into the sick bay, what they call the sick bay, and told this Japanese that I was Takasan Byoki, which means very sick. He gave me a judo chop and I bounced off the other wall, and that was my last trip to the doctor. They had no medication. All they wanted to do was torture or beat you or kill you. Normal circumstances in a big prison camp, you count off these men, which I started to tell you before, and you have a blank file in line when you're counting off for the number of men in that detail. And there's a blank file, he has no doubt escaped and gone into the jungle to fight guerrilla warfare. His chances are very, very slim that he might get by. If this man did escape, from the blank file, 5 men either side are pulled from the lines and taken out and tortured for some 3 days and nights. They're forced to dig their own grave. They're permitted to put a blindfold over their eyes before they're shot. And that's what happens when you have one man escape in a prison camp. For some unknown reason, I was very, very careful in finding who was on my side or in my group, and if they had any plans of escaping, I certainly wanted to know about it. This I only witnessed a couple times. As far as prisoners of war at some of the various other locations, Nichols Field, for example, we had named the Japanese the Wolf. The Wolf is a Japanese that loves to torture. These American prisoners of war were pushing carts of ore on wooden tracks to extend the length of a runway. If you collapsed and fell on the ground, he normally would just take a pick and pin you to the ground. That was his thrill for the day. A man is dying of dysentery and diarrhea, they'd hold him on his stomach on the ground and place a hose in his rectum and turn it on and kill him. I can remember a time when I was tortured because they wanted to know if there was a tunnel between the mainland of Bataan and Corregidor. I told the truth, and it wouldn't have made any difference what I told them. They proceeded to torture me by placing me at a desk or a table similar to this. They had an upright on either end of the table with a round rod secured across it. They had my ankles tied underneath the table at one of the cross membrums. They tied my hands like this on the pipe, and I still have the scars to show it to students. They placed dry bamboo slivers underneath the thumbnails until they protruded at the back of the nail, set them on fire and let them burn till they go out. A lot of these stories, youngsters, or young men and young women, the reason I'm telling them is just to let you realize how wonderful this country is. There's no country in this world that is superior to us. I thank God Almighty that you youngsters, or you young men and young women, will ever have to endure this sort of thing. It's a bluffing situation right now. We could be in combat, God knows where. Let's hope that it never happens. Let's hope that our nation is strong enough to protect it. And those are some of the things that we have to live with. We're getting close to the end of the war. We are aware that the Japanese are handling themselves much different than being so cocky and beating us up, starving us. And all of a sudden, overnight, the Japanese were just as nice as they could possibly be to us. They had dropped the atomic bomb on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And I was in a copper mine in northern Honshu, close enough to know the vibrations of the quake of the bomb, having no knowledge of what the heck it was. And under those circumstances is the way we existed for some 24 hours. Then they called the entire military or prisoner of war body out into what they call a parade ground, which was fenced all the way around. It was quite large, some 4 or 5 city blocks long, about 3 wide. Had us come to attention in this formation, all Japanese commands, and they bring in an interpreter who spoke very, very poor English, and he read the surrender message of the Imperial Japanese government surrendering to these United States. We as Americans, after 3.5 years, from the start of World War II until we all got back to the United States, we estimate, and it's quite close, 1 out of every 12 Americans made it home. For example, my squadron, 197 men. This was at Nichols Field. As far as I know, there were 17 survived. There were 11 missing one or more limbs, and 2 was able to stay in the service to retirement, like myself. And the other man is from New Hampshire. After the Japanese read the surrender to the American forces, we were so far out of area to get back to hospitals or where Americans were. They went through a military formation of theirs where they relieved all the Japanese guards that had caused torture to we Americans. They left the camp entirely, and 24 new guards came over and took over the weapons. And through another one of their military ceremonies, they relieved themselves of the weapons and turned them over to us. And as it happened, I ended up being sergeant of the guard. Not any great big honor, but that was my assignment. We were not only to keep the Americans from leaving the prison camp, but to keep the Japanese out. Within a couple days, and we were in a huge ravine, some 600 feet in depth. It's open to the railway on one end and mountains on the other 3 sides. American aircraft came over and started dropping food to us, medical supplies, clothing. We were so far back in the jungle area of Japan proper, pardon me, that we had to stay in this same prison camp 33 days until a railway was built so they could haul we prisoners of war out and get us on board hospital ships. During that 33 days, we had the mess hall going full bore. They dropped canned goods of every description, but everything, in most cases, fell open, and knowing what the Japanese used for fertilizer and passing more diseases around, we were cooking everything that came down. If it was fruit of any kind, it all went into one great big rice pot. If it was meat of some kind, it went into that. It's a known fact that our stomachs had shrunk to that of a small child. 2 bites of corned beef and I was full, right up to here. We kept that mess hall open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for 33 days. Then the great day came when 2 Americans came into this camp. They came in by jeep, at least part of the way. One was a news correspondent, and the other was a photographer, and showed the various things that had happened in this particular prison camp, and the torture treatments and whatever it might be. During that 33 days, the Americans took the various colors of parachutes and made an American flag, which we had never seen one in many years. I can remember students on Bataan when Bataan surrendered. I don't know how you people feel about it, but when you see the American flag taken down and replaced with a white flag, and you end up a prisoner of war of any nation, I wish I was capable of putting words how you feel inwardly, from the heart out. At the end of the 33 days in this prison camp in Japan, we marched down the hill. We all had clothes on. They fit on us like a bag. We thought we were real sharp-looking troops. I myself, weighing 97 pounds, and had a pair of shoes on, first shoes I'd had in 4 years. We marched down and went aboard this train and went to the first docks where this huge hospital ship was standing by waiting for us. Remember now, students, 3.5 years has passed, but we have made such great advances in military equipment, aircraft, all types of ships, and we looked out on that bay and saw ships we had no more knowledge than the man on the moon on what kind of ship it was. A man of war, it was unbelievable. The entire harbor was covered with military ships of all kinds. Aircraft carriers, which we had never heard of before. We were so far behind time as far as the world situation is concerned that we had to be rebriefed on what took place in World War II, in Europe, and the South Pacific. We also had picked up 2 or 3 cans of corned beef for a little bit of food, and we were like a bunch of bums. We had a bamboo pole over our shoulder with 3 cans of corned beef tied on the bitter end and a handkerchief, and we thought that was our livelihood. I had not got a penny as far as money was concerned for some 4 years. I existed on what I could steal and what they gave us, which was very, very meager. And under those circumstances is how we felt.
Mr. Tribby, I don't know how it will be. Did you tell about that shark's head incident? When you was in there?
No, I didn't. I could talk here for 4 more days about stories, but...
I didn't know what you did or not. I just thought that was interesting what she had to go through the shark's head.
Well, in this prison camp, before we started down to the train to leave, I was caught by, I had stolen some shark heads. They're a sand shark, and the head is about as big as my double fist. And I put them in a 5-gallon tin can and was preparing to cook them with rice, which I had stolen from the Japanese, and they caught me. They proceeded to put me at attention out in front of the guard shack in the snow, barefoot, for several hours. Made me stand at attention, and each hour on the hour they would come out and take the butt of the rifle and mash my feet. I'm lucky even to be able to walk today, but I made it through that also. That was just another one of their treatments of torture. We pulled out of this train and went to this huge dock, and we went into this particular set of buildings where we would be taken aboard this ship, and they proceeded to have us all take off all of our clothing. You can imagine me 6'4" with a beard down to here and very little hair on top because of starvation. And they took all of these clothing, the canned corned beef and whatever we might have brought out of prison camp, and they set them on fire and burned them all. We found out very quick why this was. Remember now, I hadn't had a bath for a year. I couldn't live, well, I'd been around so long and I didn't even smell anything. My smeller was broke, undoubtedly. But anyway, they led us in a single formation out in the middle of this pier, and they proceeded to have us, assisted us into walking through a canvas tank which was about 24 to 30 feet long, about 6 wide and 6 deep, and it was filled with sheep dip. They had us completely submerged in that sheep dip, and then when we came out on the other end, we were not aware of the armed forces having women in the armed forces like WACs and waves and so forth. The only women we knew in the armed forces at that time was in the hospital, nurses. If you can imagine 6'4" of bones getting up the other side of that and shaking my beard trying to get this grease off of me, or sheep dip off of me, it was something else. Then they assisted us on board a hospital ship. And on this hospital ship, we were debugged, deloused, and whatever else might take place. And as I remember, I got 19 needles stuck in me just going up the gangplank to get to my ward, a hospital ward. We are all eyes and ears trying to learn what is taking place in the world. But we pull out of Tokyo back to the Philippines. This was supposed to be a rehabilitation center. Eleanor Roosevelt thought that we should be repatriated. We should be brought back to civilization before we were brought back to the States. But this didn't work out quite that way. We were only there in this tent city in the Philippines for a short period of time, and we were put aboard a hospital ship and headed for the United States. Some 20-odd days it took to get back to the States, and we docked in Tacoma, Washington. 11 minutes? All right?
Yeah, I got about 10 and a half.
Can I ask why you were put through sheep dip on your way to the... Why did they do that?
Why did they do it? This so-called sheep dip, which we think it was, is to debug us. We had lice, we had rice weevils, we had all kinds of malaria and dysentery, you name it, and that was the first shower we got. And all these young women standing on the other end. Now, we weren't worried about the women because we were too far gone to worry about them. As I tell you a little bit later, you'll understand why. I was over the hill as far as women was concerned. I hadn't seen an American woman in 4 years. And they still look a lot better than Japanese. Don't they? Going back to the States, I can remember a lot of funny things that has happened. We have not, my folks have not heard from me. They have had me officially deceased for some 4 years. My hometown in Ladoga, my mother received 2 wires from Washington, D.C. One said missing in action or deceased, and the other one said deceased. And if you have conflicting wires in regards to that, you wait for a 7-year period, and if you don't show up at that time, they pay off your insurance, life insurance. When I went in home, that star and that little flag was on the front door where Mother had lost a son. I can remember one time in a prison camp, and I'm changing subjects a little bit, where this was Cabana 1 prison camp, and these grass shacks built up on stilts about 2 feet high. They thought that I had passed on with malaria, and they rolled me underneath this grass shack out of the rain. The next morning, the burial detail set up to take care of all those that passed on, and they couldn't find me. That's been pretty dead. I came to, fever left, don't ask me why. I had the good Lord working overtime again. After docking in Tacoma, Washington, they took us off the hospital ship in ambulances. They had us dressed in hospital robes and pajamas. We were taken into this huge hospital, military hospital, and we were treated fantastically. We were like kings. I proceeded to make phone calls home to let Mother know that I was alive. And as I remember, this was in 1945, I made 3 phone calls, and all she did was cry. The 4th, she was able to control herself and knew that her son was coming home. I do have to take a breather, folks. It brings tears. I used to consider I was a pretty tough guy, but you can still cry. After making these calls to Mother, my grandmother was still living, and she lived until I got home. I've had a lot of sorrows here recently, but the good Lord willing, she's not suffering. Well, I had several meals, and I thought, boy, it would be nice to go to town. I'm in Tacoma, Washington, before going by rail, hospital trains across the United States. I proceeded. This is one of my mean things to do, and I'm telling a joke about myself, but I'm sure you'll understand. I called a taxi, and I was in a hospital room, And I had a few meals, and I felt like I was a pretty good man, and I weighed probably 100 pounds. And I had this cab driver put me in the trunk of this cab and take me into Tacoma, Washington. Took me to an Army-Navy store, and I got outfitted with a full set of uniforms. This was known as the Eisenhower jacket and the officer pinks and the whole works. And a few of these little ribbons that you earn the hard way. And I said, how about taking me to oh, by the way, we have to have a black band around our arm, too, indicating that we were prisoners of war. So I said, how about taking to a tavern someplace? I'd like a Budweiser. Well, I went in there and got outfitted, and he took me to this so-called nightclub, and way down in the end was well, it was a white girl. I couldn't tell you what she looked like, but she looked awful nice to me. I'm at the age now I can be choosy, gentlemen. But anyway, I sent a drink down, or had the bartender take a drink down to her, and I got a Budweiser, and they opened it and set it out in front of me. And when I came to, I was back in the hospital. That was my first play. That one swallow of beer, and my weakness and my condition, I passed out, fell off the stool, and they came out with an ambulance and said, Sarge, did you have a good time? This is a true story. Now, we got what, 5 minutes? Has it been interesting? I hope. Has anyone gone to sleep? I don't know whether you people know when you're not hunting for food in the Philippines, you're not captured and so forth, and you're not being attacked by Japanese aircraft or infantry or whatever it might be. Some of the things that the men would do would write little poems. And I remember one of them quite well. I can't remember really what I did yesterday, but I remember what happened 40-odd years ago real well. We called it a ditty. It was a poem with rhyme to it. He says, as ends this first year, I increasingly fear, when freed and allowed to go back, with head all whirl, I'll marry some girl and later find out that she's black. I can tell you some other stories too, but I can't in this next audience. Have you enjoyed it? Let's see the hands. Thank you. Now, questions? We got about 3 minutes for questions. And I have run out of steam. Anybody, just sound off. I don't care what it is. If I can answer it, I'll take it. What else can I say? You're not going to tell me anything.
Did you ever give up hope? I mean, totally give up and wish you were dead?
I have wished I was dead, but I live from day to day. I always said, if the Americans aren't here today, tomorrow they will be. And this was a day-by-day deal for one heck of a long time. But you're so far, we have so many things here in this nation of ours. Being a prisoner of war, you were lucky to have enough clothing to cover you. You worked as a slave labor gang. Can you imagine the men? We're talking about rice and sugar and salt. 100 kilos is 220 pounds. Can you imagine prisoners of war that is down to say 140 pounds could take 100 kilos, that's 220 pounds, on your shoulder on an old abandoned ship and walk up the gangplank and drop it in the hold and do that all day and all night? I have done it many, many times. Number one reason, there was a bayonet in my back. Number two reason, I wanted to live. Now you students are aware of what we started this story out. And this you may understand. My wife of 40 years or thereabouts, who passed on in January. But I had lived with her all these years, and I talked about filthy. She got her snoot full of it. Can't you talk about anything except filthy? For 30 years, I never mentioned that I was a prisoner of war, but the last few I have. It does me good to get it off my shoulder. But along come this month, for the last 10 years, that girl would say, you got to go see those kids. Tell her story. I think that's it. Got a minute to wipe the tears.
You have any final questions for him?
Anybody?
Did you meet any Japanese that were nice? Were they all right?
Honey, the only ones I knew that was nice was Devin. The old man said I got my share up and there was no bag with it.
We want to thank you, Mr. Tribby, for coming over to share your story.
You're a grand group. You want to thank that teacher back there too. He's a fine man. And all the others. All the other people. Those weapons, by the way, over there that are opened up, file by there.
Let me...
I'm afraid to let go of it. I want to